Okay, so we are on Kaf Beis Amud Aleph. One page, here we are. 2a. Okay, so let's back up 2 lines to the beginning of this section. And what we're discussing here is the amount of witnesses are required for different parts of the Sotah in order for the law to take effect. And the Mishnah discussed essentially 2 stages. The first stage is the warning that he gives to his wife, and the second stage is her seclusion with the man about which she was warned. And then there's really a third element, but the third element is in the negative. Namely, we do not know what she did behind closed doors. If we did know what happened behind closed doors, then the Sotah is canceled. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. Hold on a second. Robert in. So the Gemara says like this. First, it quotes the Mishnah, which said, Rabbi Lezer says, that the warning that he gives to her is to be in front of 2 witnesses. That's the primary stage in making her an actual Sotah. And then there was a dispute as to whether or not there required 2 witnesses present when she secludes herself, or whether 1 is enough, or whether just his testimony alone. So in other words, everybody agrees that the moment of his warning is of primary importance in the process of the Sotah, therefore requires 2 witnesses. As is the rule for all of Torah, the 2 witnesses are required to establish any event. And then the dispute between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua is, when she secludes herself, is that of primary importance or secondary importance? And therefore the question was, does it require 2 witnesses or 1 witness? But, says the Gemara, Ad Kan, only until this point, Loi Pligi, the dispute is only Ela B'Kinoi Vistira, only with the question of when he warns her and when she secludes herself. Namely, when he warns her, everybody agrees there has to be 2 witnesses present at that moment. And Vistira, when she secludes herself, dispute 1 witness or 2 witnesses. Avo B'Tuma, but if we had but with regard to the third element, which is, as we said, a negative element, that is to say, if we know she engaged physically with this guy, then the law of the Sotah is canceled. So what kind of knowledge do we need to have of her intimate relationship with this guy? Do we have to have 2 witnesses come forward and say, I saw the 2 of them engage physically? Or, as the Gemara says now, 1 witness is enough. Because if more than 1 witness is required, then the Mishnah would have stated so. The Mishnah only discussed the first 2 elements, the element of his warning, and then the element of her seclusion. But as far as witnesses going to testify that that she was engaged physically, as soon as 1 witness comes forward, then the law of the Sotah was canceled, because no dispute was raised between Yeshua and Rabbi Lezer. It's not Nami, and the Gemara says that indeed this is taught in the Mishnah later. Eid Echad Omer, if 1 witness comes forward and says, after he warned her in front of 2 witnesses, and she secluded herself, let's say in front of 1 witness or 2 witnesses, either Rabbi Lezer or Yeshua, then a witness comes forward and says, Anita Isi Shenitmis, I saw that they actually engaged physically. She's been defiled. She would not drink. The law of the Sotah is canceled, because the whole point, as we discussed, the point of the law of the Sotah is when there's uncertainty, we don't know what happened behind the closed doors. And as soon as we know what happened behind closed doors, even if our knowledge only comes from 1 witness, then the law of the Sotah is off. Now the Gemara wants to now derive from the Torah itself, how do we know that 1 witness is enough to call off the Sotah? Ordinarily, as I mentioned before, ordinarily throughout all of Scripture, 2 witnesses are required to establish any event. 2 witnesses need to attend a marriage. 2 witnesses need to sign a contract. 2 witnesses need to come and testify and say, we saw so-and-so steal from so-and-so, and so on and so forth. So generally speaking, it always requires 2 witnesses. And the question is, why, or what's the implication from the Scripture itself that the Sotah is an exception? And it's not as if she's an exception completely, because when he warns her, we do need 2 witnesses, right? So it's not as if the law of the Sotah is a complete exception. It's only specifically with respect to our knowledge of her defilement, that if our knowledge of her defilement is predicated on 1 witness, then that's enough to cancel the law of the Sotah. because we already know she engaged physically, and even though our knowledge is only coming from one witness, and therefore we need to know, we need to find from scripture how it is that this particular element of the Sotah is an exception to the rule, and that even if we know based on one witness that she was physical, law of the Sotah is canceled. So let's see. So midaraisa from scripture, minalan, how do we know the mehemen eid echad, that we believe one witness who comes forward and says, I saw the two of them engage physically, and as a result of his one testimony, we cancel the law of the Sotah, even though she's already been warned in front of two witnesses and she's been secluded. Now one witness comes and says, I saw them engage physically, law of the Sotah is off. How do we know this from scripture? Where the scriptural inference? So the Tanur Rabbanan, for our sages taught, in analyzing the scripture, the verse reads as follows. Ve'ed einba. There is no witness to what happened. This is a verse we quoted in our introduction to this class. We learned the scripture. And this is the verse which describes her secluding with the man she warned him about. And then the verse says, there is no witness to what happened behind closed door. Note, it says witness in the singular. There is no witness, singular. And then the verse goes on to say, and she was not raped. Then the law of the Sotah applies, so on and so forth. So this is a crucial verse. It describes, on the one hand, we know for a certainty she wasn't raped, which means we do know what happened, something about what happened behind closed doors. But yet it says there is no witness. So if there's no witness, and yet we know she was raped, she was not raped, then the law of the Sotah is off. So if there's no witness, how do we know what happened? So therefore the Mishnaic H text says, the word witness actually does not mean one witness. It means one testimony. And one testimony is two people. And if when the verse says they were secluded, and we have no testimony as to what happened behind closed doors, but we know she wasn't raped. How do we know? Because one witness did see. So here we already see that as soon as one witness shows up and says we know what happened behind closed doors, the law of the Sotah is off. Because the verse says, Eid Einba. There is no testimony to what happened behind closed doors, but there is a witness. So, and that's what the Mishnah says here. The verse, when it says there is no witness, is not referring to one singular witness, but referring to a testimony. And a testimony is two. Ein Boshnayim, there's a kasabadaber. There's no two witnesses there. So the Gemara counters and says, okay, so that's very established. The verse says there's no testimony to what happened behind closed doors, which means we don't have two witnesses behind closed doors, and yet the law of the Sotah is canceled because we have one witness. And this is how we derive this exception to the rule, that as soon as we have one witness that says that she was physical behind closed doors, the law of the Sotah is canceled. If I'm not clear, please unmute yourself and ask.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know. It's clear, but I don't know. I don't get it, because I mean, the fact that you're saying testimony doesn't negate that you still need two witnesses.
You do. So
if you have one, but if you have one, it's enough to negate the whole.
Right. So let's see what the verse says. The verse says, Ve'ed Einba, there is no testimony, which means the verse is saying we don't have two. But what do we have? We have some knowledge of what's going on. How do we know we have some knowledge? Because the verse goes on to say she's not raped.
Right.
Which means we know what happened, and yet we have no testimony. So what information do we have? Which is why concluding.
So something not happening is enough to say that this is what happened.
Correct.
Basically.
Correct. Because the verse is explicit that we have no testimony, and yet we are aware of something that happened because we know she wasn't raped, means that there is some sort of witness.
Right.
If there isn't two. So it means there must be one. And thus we derive that one witness is enough to say she didn't engage, and therefore, or one witness is enough to say that she did engage physically, and therefore the law of the Sotah is off. Because he's the one that's coming and saying, I saw she engaged willingly, she wasn't raped. This is not a full testimony, but Torah still validates it, even as a single witness.
Right. So why start off by saying two? Because theoretically, one would have been enough to begin with.
Yeah. So
by saying this is not what happened,
So the Gemara is going to get into that as to like why.
Understand my question?
Yes. In other words, what you're at, the Gemara, I think is going to ask this. I think what you're asking is a question the Gemara is going to ask soon, which essentially is why introduce the notion of maybe two and then cancel it by saying we only had one? Just don't say anything.
Don't say anything, or just say anybody who says this is not what happened, then it's enough to say that to negate the whole business.
Yeah, the Gemara is going to get into that later.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
If you're introducing, okay, yeah, we need 7 people to say that they saw the moon, 7, not 2, right? And if one guy says I did see the moon, well, that's enough. What are you talking about? Why do you say 7 if 1 is enough?
Yeah. So the Gemara is going to get into that, and the bottom line is, as we're going to see, because this is an exception to the rule, we would have went through lengths to interpret it as to not be an exception to the rule. So the Torah has to be as explicit as possible in saying this is an exception, because it's unusual that we're relying on one witness. And had it not been so explicit, we would have misinterpreted it. And that's what the Gemara is going to go through. What are the different forms of misinterpretation that we might have picked up on? That's what the Gemara is going to go through over the next half a page or so.
Because then you're saying that that person is a very reliable witness by saying that doesn't happen. Because normally you need 2, because if you have contradictory information, then the 2 don't negate themselves.
Right.
1 is not in it, right? That's the whole idea of 2.
Yeah. So the Gemara is going to say the reason why one witness is believed here is because there's a history. We have 2 witnesses warning. We already know there's jealousy between the husband and wife because we have 2 witnesses saying he warned her. We already know that she's hanging, flirting with this other guy, right? So the Gemara's language, which means there's literally means there's feet to the story, meaning it's not just a story that's out of thin air. It's a story that has background, and therefore we allow one witness to say that he saw her engage physically, especially considering.
You have to take it over the edge.
Exactly, especially considering that actually the result of this is that she doesn't drink the Sotah waters.
Right.
So we're saving ourselves from a whole ritual because the story has enough context to say that one witness is saying the truth. That's basically where the Gemara is going to go. But the Gemara is going to prove, before it gets to there, it's going to go through the scriptures as to what I would have thought had the Torah not explicitly stated that one witness is enough here.
Right. It's also, you're saying, you're definitely relying on this one person. He could have been really upset about the whole situation. Or he could have been like mad at the lady, whatever, and just decided, well, I did
marriage. Yeah, but yes, it's possible, but they're not only relying on him, because there's a whole context here. There's a whole history. He warned her, and
I get it, but he's the final verdict, basically.
Yeah, but his final verdict is actually to save her from being a Sotah, from drinking this, from going through this humiliating.
Right, but it doesn't help. Doesn't help the situation because it's out there in the open.
Yeah, well, look, if she engaged physically with this other guy, their marriage is in shambles anyway.
Right.
We're only saving her from the embarrassment of the ritual.
I got it.
Lenient on saving her from this embarrassment. Okay. But now the Gemara is going to get into explaining how this is an exception. So what we have so far is the verse which says there is no testimony, and testimony is 2, but yet we do have some information. So therefore we must conclude that there's one person there, at least one person saw it. Now the Gemara says like this. Perhaps when the verse says there is no testimony, it means literally nobody's there, not even one person. Maybe there's nobody there. Now, as for the fact that how do we know that she wasn't raped, the Gemara is going to put that on the side for a moment and can analyze it simply from a comparative legal scriptural level. So ignore the fact that we know that she was not raped, which seems to imply we have some information. Forget that for a second, Rashi tells us, and just look at the words of the verse. The verse says there is no testimony. We translate that to mean there's no 2, but there is 1. Well, maybe it means there's nobody. Says the Gemara, that can't be the case, even from the words of the verse. How so? Because Talmud Sotah, the verse elsewhere says, La yakum et echad beish. This is the verse which introduces the universal rule that all testimony must be 2. And this is how the verse says it. Exact translation of every word, because it's important. La yakum, you shall not establish, eid echad, one person, one witness, beish, with a singular man. Rather, says the verse, it should be 2 or 3 going forward. So the Gemara picks up on the fact that the language is doubled. It says, "La yakum eid echad beish." You should not establish on a witness 1 man. It could just say, don't establish it on a witness, and that would have been us. So says the Gemara, from the fact that the verse says, do not establish it on a be'ish. Don't establish it on a witness, a man. Do I not know that we're talking about a singular individual? Why does it then again say one? Do not establish it on a single witness, a man. Just say, don't establish it on a single man. It has to go and say twice, Eid be'ish, a singular man witness, be'echad one. Why the double expression? So matam echad. Why does the verse have to explicitly state one? Again, we're talking about the verse which is giving us the universal rule that all witnesses must be two, all testimony must be two. And the Torah says so by saying, do not establish the matter based on the words of one witness, a single man. Double expression. Why so? Says the Gemara, Zeh bana av. This builds, literally means it builds a father. This is a binyan av is one of the 13 principles that are from which we derive the Torah. We read it every day before Haidu. Rabbi Shmuel said there are 13 principles upon which the Torah is derived, and one of them is binyan av. Binyan av means when the Torah states something to establish its way of thinking throughout the rest of Scripture. And here's an example. The Torah says, do not establish a witness, a single man. So says the Torah, says the Gemara like this. What the Torah is telling you is that whenever I use the words a witness, even though it's singular, you should know I'm referring to two. Unless I tell you a single man. Following? Which is why the Torah uses a double expression. The Torah uses a double expression of saying, do not establish it based on a single witness, a single man, to tell you that right now here in this verse I'm talking about one person. But ordinarily speaking, when I use the word aid, even though aid is a singular, I actually mean two, because I mean a testimony, not a witness, unless I explicitly tell you otherwise. That's how the Gemara says it. Zebana av, this builds a principle. Whenever the Torah uses the language aid, which literally means a witness, I'm referring to two. Unless the Torah explicitly goes on to say, I mean a single person, like it does here. So the Torah says like this, do not establish a matter based on the testimony of a witness, a single man. Because had I not said single man, you would have thought that what does a witness means? It means a full testimony of two people. But from the fact that I explicitly stated a witness, a single man, that means to say, here's the exception, that now when I say the word aid, I mean one person. But elsewhere when I say the word aid, I mean two. Right? And now back to our verse. Our verse by the Sotah says there is no aid, there is no testimony. And we've established based on the other verse that whenever the Torah says the word aid, it means two. And therefore, today, the Torah therefore says lesba, that there is no two witnesses, because the Torah says ein aid ba. The story of the Sotah does not have a testimony. And we've established based on the other verse that whenever the Torah uses the word testimony in the singular, it refers to two. And therefore, if the Torah says there is no two witnesses, what is there? There is some information, elachad. There's one witness. And this one witness says, that she was not raped, but she was engaged physically. And therefore, asura, therefore she's forbidden. So let's recap what happened here, and we'll stop over here. So the Gemara is basically telling us as follows. Let's work it backwards instead of like reverse engineering, instead of going through the Gemara's back and forth. We have a verse which teaches us the universal rule of witnesses. In that, every testimony in Torah must have two people. How does the Torah inform us of this? The Torah informs us of this law by saying as follows. Do not establish any matter on the word of a testimony of a single man. This double expression, a testimony, a witness, a single man, is coming to teach you that whenever the Torah uses the word a testimony, it means two. Unless I tell you explicitly, I only mean one person, like I'm doing right now. I'm telling you, do not establish a testimony on a single man. So right now, I've told you specifically I mean a single man. But ordinarily, when I use the word witness, I mean two people. Now, if that's the case, we have to go through all of Torah. And whenever the Torah uses the word aid in the singular, a testimony in the singular, it actually means two people. Now let's apply that rule to the Sotah. The law of the Sotah says the verse, there is no testimony to what happened behind closed door, but we know she wasn't raped and therefore she's forbidden to her husband. Okay, so what information do we have? The Torah says there is no testimony. We've established testimony means two people, but we have information that she wasn't raped and she was physical. That's one witness. So this teaches us. So now we can see clearly from the verse that one witness coming forward and telling us that he saw the two of them engage physically, law of the Sotah is off, so long as she wasn't raped and she engaged willingly. And this is all based on the fact that the Torah says, we do not have a testimony in the singular, but a testimony in the singular has been established to mean two witnesses. But we do have one stating that she was not raped, but that she was physical. Okay, is that clear? It's a little back and forth, but I hope it's somewhat clear.
I think so.
Yes?
Sure.
Okay, if it isn't, sorry?
No, it's interesting because when you have a kasuba, right?
Yeah.
And you're writing the name of the person, and at the end you write a.
Right. So the eight, that's why I use the word testimony.
That's one person because there's clearly a second one.
Right. That's why I use the word testimony, because otherwise the translation is hard to see. What is it? How does the word aid in the singular mean two
Aid
people?
is definitely one person.
Right, because aid means
aid.
Right, which
aid.
is one.
What's the plural for aid?
Aidim.
Aidim. Right.
So that's why I translate it as testimony, because testimony is like a legal term for an accepted, established understanding, and therefore, if Torah decides that a testimony isn't valid unless you have two, then I can translate the word aid as testimony, unless Torah explicitly says I'm talking about one person.
Could it be the
Sorry, go ahead, Robert.
sorry, could it be that the rationale for this exception is like you said earlier, that to spare the
woman,
the woman embarrassment and going through the process of sotah, which has negative implications against not only her but her husband, and the community at large.
Yes, it's the community at large. Also, as we learned in the beginning of Sotah, we learned at the beginning of the Gemara that anybody who sees a Sotah should re-examine his own personal life, right? So yes, that's a good point. The Gemara doesn't say it directly. The Gemara kind of says that that we already have background. Where did I see it? Maybe it's in Rashi.
Anyway, I got to run, guys.
Have a good day, Jacob.
Okay, Shkoyach, thank you so much.
So, I'm trying to remember where I saw it, but the Gemara basically, did I see it in the Gemara? Yeah, here the Gemara says it here. Raglayim l'davar. Raglayim l'davar literally means there are feet to the matter, as if to say there's already context in which the single witness would be believed. But I think you're right. Also, I think more broadly speaking, we want to spare her of all this craziness, and she already has a whole history with her husband. There's jealousy going on. Obviously, there's some problems going on. So let's just spare her, take the witness, and go with it. But it's you also need the fact that there's context. Otherwise, we wouldn't take the testimony of one person just to spare someone embarrassment unless we had some grounding to believe this one person, which is what the Gemara is searching for in this whole analysis. But I do believe you're correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Good day. Thank you. Shkoyach.
Pleasure. Looking forward to tomorrow morning.